Okay, welcome back to the wrap-up and the conclusion of these lectures on the optimality of the genetic code. And I would like to begin our conclusion by again revisiting the quote of Charles Darwin, "Yet I can see no evidence of beneficent design, or indeed of design of any kind in the details." I feel, and I hope you agree, that it is precisely when we examine the details that the evidence of design begins to loom large. And let us now get to the punchline. So I think the you now get the point. I think that we see clearly that this code is an essentially perfect code. So the question then becomes, well, this is the universal code. You can see this little cartoon to teach kids about biology. What does the DNA of all these organisms have in common? Well, they all share a universal genetic code. And this code you'll find in biology books is called nearly universal. There are a few minor variations in mitochondria and so forth, but it is essentially a universal code. And it is the universal code which has been there since the beginning of life. So the question becomes, when biology teaches us that when we see something like an eye and we say, wow, this is a nearly perfect structure, how could that be? Biology says, standard biology, that, well, this is the result of the long process of evolution through minute random changes, minimal random improvements that are plucked out by the process of natural selection. So the question then becomes, how is it that we end up with a nearly perfect code right off the bat when there has been no time for it to evolve? How do we begin with an optimal code? That certainly flies against the notion that optimality is the result of the long, gradual, random process of evolution. And to flesh out this question, or to kind of spotlight this conclusion, we want to ask, how old is the genetic code? And this question, or this analysis, was undertaken by a group led by Professor Manfred Eigen. He's a Nobel laureate in chemistry, by the way. And their analysis was attempting to examine the notion that the genetic code could be of extraterrestrial origin, meaning that life began somewhere else and was transported to Earth. This is a theory that some people hold, among them a very famous astrophysicist named Fred Hoyle, for example. But in any case, they did a very sophisticated statistical analysis, and their conclusion in their paper is that you can see it in the little blurb I've put here. It is concluded that the genetic code is not older than, but almost as old as our planet. And I've plucked out one sentence from the paper. The code cannot be older than 3.8 plus minus 0.6 billion years. So their estimate was that this is roughly how old the genetic code is, 3.8 billion years. How old is life on Earth? The best estimates is that it is about 3.86 billion years. So this code was there at the beginning in a nearly perfect condition. How can that be if it was not intelligently designed to be so? And I think this analysis really speaks for itself in support of intelligent design. Now, one final issue to touch on. Let's look at the title of this paper, Origin and Evolution of the Genetic Code, the Universal Enigma. And if you take the time to sort of read some of this paper, they are saying that the code is essentially a universal code and that it is nearly perfect in terms of robustness to translational errors, other errors, and so on. And they say that this, in parentheses, nearly perfect standard code is universal. And that is another enigma. How is it that we began with a nearly perfect code? And why is it that this code is universal? We see everything else on the planet very varied in terms of life. Different body plans, different metabolic arrangements. For goodness sakes, we have plants, we have animals, we have bacteria, we have fungi, all of them really so different in terms of speciation. And we've already seen through the mathematical analyses that there are numerous possible genetic codes. We saw those bell curves. Why is it that some organisms why is it that all organisms use the same code? It could have very easily been, in fact, it would seem to make the most sense, following the same pattern that we see in organisms in general in terms of variability, that some organisms would have used one code, and more sophisticated organisms would have used a better code, and the most sophisticated organisms would use a still more efficient code as things evolved over time. Yet we see that the code is universal. So, both its essential perfection in terms of being a wonderfully efficient code, as well as its universality, as well as its age being there right from the beginning of life. So it's universal not only horizontally but vertically. It is universal across all organisms and universal across all ages and times. That is a very, very compelling case for intelligent design. When scientists try to answer the questions that have been posed here, if you read the literature closely, they admit that this is an enigma, and this paper says it's an enigma. And they try to resolve the enigma in different ways. That maybe the genetic code evolved quickly from a simpler code, maybe there was co-evolution between the genetic code and proteins. Some of them say, well, these things are so implausible. They just say that, as the last line of the paper says, that it is some version of a frozen accident, that by accident, nature happened to stumble on a nearly perfect code, and because it was so nearly perfect, it was frozen in that state. And all of this is really a deliberate attempt to ignore the possibility of intelligent design, because that is kind of the mindset of science now. But thankfully, we are living in an age where the more detail we're able to examine, I think that the pendulum is beginning to swing back. We said that in the age of Newton, scientists in general believed that the mathematical perfection of the universe was a reflection of God's handiwork. Then, with the philosophy of David Hume, with the science of Charles Darwin, science swung away from that. And talking about divine design became a no-no, became sort of ridiculous. But now, the more we learn, I believe that the pendulum is beginning to swing back. And you may ask yourself, how is it that in the face of such evidence, so many scientists still refuse to even consider the explanation of intelligent design as a possibility, when clearly it's a theoretical possibility? If something looks designed, one possibility is that it is designed. But why do so many scientists even refuse to examine this possibility on a scientific basis? I have really only found one truly honest answer, and I'm going to share it with you in the next slide. This answer was given by George Wald, Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine in 1967. He basically stated that the reason is philosophical, and his quote speaks for itself. He says, quote, "I will not believe that philosophically," meaning that is intelligent design. "I will not believe that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible." spontaneous generation arising to evolution. I have yet to find another scientist as honest as this, but to me this is the only rational explanation how in the face of compelling evidence so many scientists refuse to not only accept but to even entertain the design hypothesis. And God knows best. I hope you found this interesting and instructive, and we will continue looking at the structure and function of DNA. This is just the beginning of the marvels. Assalamu alaikum and God bless.